Border justice, the truth behind bars. Greg Abbott, governor of Texas, passed a law that let police arrest immigrants on sight. No judge, no warrant, just suspicion. Then innocent Americans started vanishing, detained for their skin color, their accent, their silence. That's when Jasmine Crockett stepped in and uncovered a $24 million contract tied to detention quotas and Abbott's own financial network. The fallout shook everything. Public trust, state policy, and the lie they built it all on. Was this ever about border security? Or did Greg Abbott turn human suffering into a business plan? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Texas in early summer wasn't just hot. It was punishing. The kind of heat that made the air taste like metal, that turned parking lots into ovens, that made breath itself feel heavy, like breathing through smoke. In towns along the southern border, rows of white buses lined up like military convoys, engines running, windows blacked out, humanity caged behind glass. Greg Abbott had just signed an executive order. Dozens of buses packed with undocumented migrants shipped to Democrat sanctuary cities. CNN flashed the headline in red. Fox called it a bold defense of state rights. The governor called it a humanitarian act. But the images told a different story. Toddlers crying into their mothers' shirts. Elderly men clutching medicine bottles. Teenagers with shoelaces removed and wrists zip-tied. It didn't look like humanitarian aid. It looked like a purge. Jasmine Crockett, congresswoman from Texas's 30th district, didn't wait for the headlines to cool. By the time Abbott stood at his podium, Jasmine had already stepped in front of a dozen microphones in Dallas. What is doing, she said with measured rage, is turning human lives into political cargo. She wasn't a governor. She didn't have riot police or state funding. What she had was history. She had once spent a night inside the Texas Capitol, refusing to leave until lawmakers read out loud the full text of a bill designed to suppress minority voters. She had been tear-gassed during protests, censured on the House floor, told to act like a lady more times than she could count. And still, here she stood, unmoved, unafraid. Abbott claimed his buses were compassion in motion. Jasmine called them what they were, political theater written in pain, driven by cruelty. Reporters fell silent. The nation watched. Behind Jasmine, the footage rolled, faces pressed against windows, hands clutching rosaries. A little girl mouthing one desperate word, "Mommy." Jasmine didn't blink. This isn't about safety, she said. It's about dehumanization. And Texas has seen enough of that in its history. Her voice didn't shake. Her stare didn't drop. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking for migrants. She was speaking for every person who'd ever been told they were expendable. And so the question pierced the humid Texas air, hung above every headline, whispered through every newsroom, repeated on every talk show. Can a black woman without a badge, without a state house, without an army take on the most powerful man in Texas and win? She dug into the text like a surgeon searching for a tumor, knowing something poisonous had to be hiding beneath the surface. And there it was, nestled inside the sterile phrasing of the State Emergency Immigration Enforcement Act, a single clause that read like it belonged in the pages of a dystopian thriller, not a democratic state's law book. It granted sweeping power to Texas State Police, the power to detain any individual they merely suspected of being in the country unlawfully. No warrant required, no court order, no obligation to notify federal authorities. It was unilateral judgment, executed on sight. The language was maddeningly vague, like a trap written in fog. What exactly counted as reasonable suspicion? Who decided it? What did suspicion look like to a Tide Patrol officer working a double shift in 110-degree heat? Was it the color of someone's skin? A Spanish accent? A hoodie? A pause too long before answering in English? That's all it took. A glance. A whisper. And suddenly, your life could be swallowed by the state. But the horror wasn't just in the words. The true terror came after, when the law's consequences began to bleed into real lives. Jasmine's phone rang one night at 11:47 p.m. A young organizer from San Antonio was sobbing the other end. A man named Diego Morales, a U.S. citizen, a Marine Corps veteran, father of two, born and raised in El Paso, had just been arrested at a gas station for loitering near the border. His only crime? Forgetting his wallet at home. No ID, No phone. No rights, apparently. He was thrown into a holding cell without explanation. Left there for 3 days. Ignored. Unnamed. Forgotten. Until someone ran his fingerprints and realized they had caged a war hero. In McAllen, a 63-year-old grandmother with arthritis and a laminated citizenship card was zip-tied in front of her crying grandchildren. The officer reportedly told her, "These could be fake. We've seen worse." And in Dallas, a high school junior delivering Uber Eats after class was detained and sent to ICE custody because he answered a question in broken English. Jasmine didn't need to imagine these stories. They flooded her inbox, her voicemails, her soul. One after another, like water over a dam ready to break. She didn't see mistakes. She saw design. She saw how the law had been engineered not to protect but to profile. How a phrase as slippery as reasonable suspicion could be turned into a loaded gun placed in the hands of anyone wearing a badge and a bias. She saw clearly what others refused to admit. That in the eyes of this policy, your very existence could be criminalized if your skin wasn't pale enough, your English wasn't perfect enough, or your paperwork wasn't flawless enough. This wasn't about national security. It wasn't about border control. It was about fear, the weaponization of it, the political exploitation of it, the legal insulation of it. The law had not failed. It had worked exactly as designed. To Greg Abbott, it was a tactic. To Jasmine Crockett, it was a state-approved license for racial targeting, a smoke screen of public safety wrapped around systemic injustice. And the deeper she looked, the more undeniable the truth became. This was never just about immigration. This was about control, about who is seen, who is erased, and who is free to walk away untouched. And Jasmine? She had no intention of walking away. Not this time. Not ever. When silence became complicity, Jasmine knew there was only one place left to take the fight. Straight to the floor of Congress. Under oath. In front of the cameras. With the truth laid bare for the entire nation to hear. The hearing room was packed so tightly that even the air felt charged, thick with the kind of tension you could almost hear. Rows of reporters hunched over their notepads. Congressional aides hovered at the edges, whispering into hidden earpieces. The marble walls seemed to lean inward, magnifying every breath, every shifting shoe, every clicking camera lens. At the center of it all stood Jasmine Crockett, framed in the bright, pitiless lights of the C-SPAN cameras. She wore a navy suit sharp enough to cut glass, her crucifix chain barely visible at her collar, her hands steady as they rested on a thick folder brimming with names and faces. She didn't shuffle papers. She didn't look around for support. She stood like a verdict already rendered. And when the chairman finally gave her the floor, she didn't waste a second. Her voice rang out, clean and fierce, slicing through the static. This is not immigration enforcement. This is racial profiling given a badge and a license to hunt. She opened the folder with deliberate slowness, pulling out a photo. Diego Morales, Marine Corps veteran, wrists zip-tied, slumped against a patrol car, still wearing his Veterans of Foreign Wars cap. She held it high above the microphone where every lens could see it. Gasps erupted on the Democratic side of the aisle. Uncomfortable shifting filled the Republican side. Jasmine's face did not flinch. Her voice was measured, like a surgeon making the first incision. When skin color becomes reasonable suspicion, we are not enforcing the law. We are enforcing fear. She placed the photo down only to lift another, a teenage boy in a delivery uniform, hands cupped behind his back, his Uber Eats bag tossed on the ground like trash. Another click of a photo, another life detained without cause, another scar left by a policy dressed up as public safety. The rhythm of her delivery was relentless, not rushed, an unfolding indictment that grew heavier with every documented injustice. The chamber began to shift. Subtle at first, like the first groan of steel before a bridge collapses. Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone now, her words slowing, sharpening, building towards something no one in that room would be able to forget. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice deepening, cracking through the pretense of civility that coated the room like cheap paint. When the color of your skin becomes a reason you are stopped, questioned, stripped of your freedom, or simply made to vanish behind bars, that is not public safety. That is not law enforcement. That is terror, state-sponsored, uniformed, and paid for by taxpayers. She let the words hang there, Heavy, brutal. No one dared move. Even a political enemy sat frozen, caught in the blast radius of a truth too raw to sidestep. She could have ended there. She could have let the silence carry her point. But Jasmine wasn't there for applause. She wasn't there to win a soundbite. She was there to make sure that every American watching, whether in the living rooms of Dallas, the bodegas of Brooklyn, or the dusty fields outside El Paso, understood exactly what was at stake. She straightened her back, fixed her gaze squarely into the heart of the camera lens, and delivered the line that would shatter the country's delusion of distance. When the law is used to arrest vulnerable people and the police use their power to do wrong, that's not about keeping order anymore. That's oppression. And when oppression shows up, it doesn't ask for permission. It breaks in, kicks down the door, and destroys people's lives. And just like that, the room wasn't merely listening. It was holding its breath. But not everyone in power wanted to hear the truth Jasmine had spoken under oath. And within hours, the backlash came, loud, calculated, and broadcast of millions. The attack didn't come from a press release. It came from prime time. Fox News, 8 p.m. sharp. The slot reserved for red meat headlines and rhetorical fireworks. Governor Greg Abbott sat center frame, backlit in patriotic blue, an American flag draped conveniently behind his shoulder. His tie was perfectly knotted, his expression perfectly measured. The headline across the screen read, "Governor responds to radical race accusations." And the host, grinning like he'd already read the script, asked, "What do you make of Congresswoman Crockett's explosive testimony today?" Abbott didn't blink. "I'll tell you what I make of it," he said. "This isn't about protecting migrants. This is about pushing a narrative. Jasmine Crockett isn't fighting for justice. She's manufacturing outrage. She's a professional race baiter, a fire starter looking for a stage." He paused long enough to let the insult soak in. "This isn't civil rights," he smirked. "This is show business. And she's doing it with taxpayer dollars." Within 30 seconds, the clip had been chopped and circulated by every major conservative blog in the country. It flooded Facebook feeds. It exploded on Twitter. Conservative influencers turned it into a slogan: "Crockett lies, Texas pays." Hashtags followed. Memes followed. But what followed for Jasmine was something darker, more personal. Her office received thousands of messages in a single night. Some were just insults. Others were threats. "Keep your mouth shut. Stay in your lane. Watch your back." And across it all, the same pattern pulsed underneath. She had told the truth too clearly, too boldly, and the system had responded the only way it knew how, not by answering her claims, but by attacking her character. The hardest part wasn't the smear campaign. Jasmine had weathered storms before. What hit hardest was a quiet betrayal. Colleagues who had clapped behind closed doors now refused to be seen near her on the House floor. Former allies, people she had defended, vouched for, even protected, suddenly had scheduling conflicts when cameras appeared. Staffers averted their eyes in the hallway. Journalists who once begged for quotes now quoted Abbott instead. "Governor defends law against activist attack," one article read. "Congresswoman accused of fueling racial division," read another. The narrative was shifting, and Jasmine was being buried beneath it. Not because she was wrong, but because she was too right, too fast, too visible. She knew what this was. This wasn't a debate. It was retaliation. The oldest kind. The kind used when a black woman dared to speak without trembling. The kind used when someone told a truth that couldn't be denied, so they tried to make her lie instead. They wanted to make her name radioactive, make her too risky to stand aside, isolate her, drown her in noise, silence her by shaming her voice. It wasn't new. It wasn't clever. But it was still happening in 2025, on national television, with the state's highest office holder calling her a fraud for refusing to stay quiet. But words alone couldn't expose what was hidden behind government fences and bureaucratic lies. So Jasmine did what no one expected. She went to see it with her own eyes. The road to the El Paso facility was dry and unmarked, paved in dust and denial. Jasmine drove alone, the sky just beginning to lighten over the desert horizon, casting long orange streaks across the windshield like scars. Ants chaos. This is treasonous. Her suit was gone. In its place, jeans, a plain gray polo shirt, and a borrowed badge clipped to her chest reading Community Support Liaison. It was fake, but convincing enough to get her through 2 security checkpoints with barely a glance. No one looked twice. They never did when the visitor was quiet, female, and looked like she was just there to check boxes. A guard handed her a clipboard, waved her toward the intake bay. He didn't ask for ID. He didn't care. He didn't see a congresswoman walking in. He saw someone he could ignore. And that was exactly what Jasmine needed, to disappear into the system. The warehouse was massive. Low ceilings, flickering fluorescent lights, and a smell that stuck to the lungs. Bleach, urine, metal, sweat. She walked past rows of chain-link enclosures. Not rooms, not cells, but cages. Some were packed with adult men sitting shoulder to shoulder on the floor, wrists still bound with plastic cuffs. Others held families. Mothers curled around infants. Teenagers pacing like caged animals, trying to remember what fresh air felt like. The noise was quiet but not peaceful. It was the hum of resignation, the sound of people who had stopped asking if anyone was coming to help. Then came the children, dozens of them, maybe more, some no older than 5 or 6, huddled under thin aluminum blankets that crinkled like candy wrappers when they moved. Their shoes had been taken. Some had no socks. A few wore only oversized shirts and underwear, their eyes wide, hollow, watching Jasmine as she walked by like they weren't sure if she was real. And then came the voice that would stay with her for the rest of her life. It was a little girl's voice. Soft, hoarse, barely audible beneath the humming lights. Can you tell them I just want to see my mom? The child couldn't have been older than 6. Her fingers gripped the fence like it was the only thing holding her to earth. Jasmine stopped mid-step. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't have an answer. There was no promise she could make in good faith. No way to fix it in that second. She knelt down slowly until her eyes met the girl through the chain link. She didn't speak. She just looked at her and nodded gently, as if to say, I hear you. I won't forget you. And that was all she could give. What the girl didn't know was that Jasmine's glasses weren't just for vision. Hidden behind the frame was a micro lens, blinking silently, recording everything. The cages, the zip ties, the barefoot children, the guards laughing at their phones, the water fountain with no water, the clock that didn't work. She moved through the facility like a ghost, invisible but fully awake, documenting every injustice with the calm of someone whose anger had evolved into purpose. She didn't cry. Not there. Not yet. She had learned long ago that tears could wait, but truth couldn't. She passed by a mother who hadn't been allowed to call her husband in 2 weeks. A teenage boy with blood on his shirt and no medical attention. A toddler crying alone in a cage labeled unaccompanied minor number 47. She burned every detail into memory, every face, every smell, every sound. She stayed as long as she could without raising suspicion. Then she walked out the same way she came in, through the side gate, past the empty parking lot, back into the silence of the morning heat. But something had changed, because somewhere between those barbed wire fences and the silence of the outside world, a question had taken root and refused to die. Does justice still live here? On this border? In this country? In this century? And when no one in power answered that question, Jasmine knew what she had to do next. Walk into the fire and ask it live in front of the entire nation. The CNN studio had the shine of neutrality. Polished floors, soft blue backlights, a news ticker crawling calmly at the bottom of the screen. But nothing about this night was calm. Everyone watching knew it. This wasn't just a panel. It was a confrontation. A collision between 2 visions of America. Jasmine Crockett sat at the far end of the glass table, dressed in black, composed. But every line in her posture radiated control under pressure. Across from her, Governor Greg Abbott looked every bit the statesman. Clean-cut, practiced, calm. But behind his carefully measured smile, there was tension. The host opened the segment with mild introductions, but no one was really listening. Viewers at home weren't here for pleasantries. They were waiting for fire. Abbott struck first. The people of Texas are overwhelmed, he began, voice steady, confident. We are dealing with an uncontrolled flow of illegal immigration. Border towns are stretched to their breaking point. Resources are depleted. Our citizens are at risk. This isn't just a policy issue. It's an invasion. The word dropped like a grenade. He repeated it again, slower this time. An invasion. The host nodded slightly, as if it were a term everyone had quietly agreed upon. Cameras zoomed in. Abbott folded his hands. It was clear he believed he had delivered a decisive blow. Jasmine didn't interrupt. She waited, letting his words hang in the air like smoke. And then, without raising her voice, without even changing her expression, she spoke with force that rewired the room. "You call it an invasion," she said. "But what I see, what I just saw, are women with toddlers sleeping on concrete. What I see are children crying behind fences, barefoot, dehydrated, with no one coming for them. And you standing here calling them enemies of the state." Abbott shifted slightly. "Not much, but enough." Jasmine leaned in. "Do you know what it's like to sit in front of a 6-year-old girl and hear her ask, 'Can someone tell him I just want to see my mom?' and then walk away because no one in your administration will give her an answer?" Her voice didn't shake, but the silence around her did. "You call that security? You think the state of Texas is being attacked by frightened families running from gang violence and famine? Then maybe it's not the border that's broken. Maybe it's your definition of humanity." The host looked down, fumbling with a note card. Abbott opened his mouth, but Jasmine wasn't finished. "Let's be clear," she said, her voice slicing through the static like a scalpel. "You're not overwhelmed. You're not under attack. What you are is on camera. And you've decided to use human suffering as your platform because scaring people is easier than solving problems." Her hand reached under the desk, produced a printed still, an image from her hidden camera footage. It showed the child pressed against the cage, holding her hands up to no one. Jasmine slid the photo across the table, right in front of Abbott. "Look at her," she said. "Say it again. Look at that little girl and say she's a threat." And just when the air felt like it couldn't hold one more ounce of tension, Jasmine reached into her folder, pressed a button on the remote, and let the truth speak louder than anything she could ever say. The remote in Jasmine's hand felt small, almost weightless as she pressed a button without fanfare. The studio lights dimmed slightly. The massive screen behind the debate desk blinked once, then filled with raw, grainy footage. At first, the images stuttered, shaky, handheld, imperfect. But then they sharpened, brutally real. Her eyes moved back to the line above it. "Waiver competitive bidding approved under Executive Order 982B. That's when her stomach dropped. This wasn't a normal contract. This was fast-tracked, off the books, written to avoid every legal safeguard in place. She clicked into the metadata. The file had been created at 2:41 a.m., signed electronically by a mid-level operations officer, and approved without a single note from a procurement review board. No deliberation. No oversight. No record. It was like the contract had been conjured out of thin air, passed from hand to hand like a hot secret, all under the cover of darkness. Jasmine zoomed in on the vendor field. The name hit her like a punch. Centurion Logistics Group. The same firm she had already connected to the detention camps, the per-head payment structure, and Governor Abbott's indirect financial interests. But this time, it wasn't about gradual corruption. It was a direct injection of state money, signed overnight with no oversight. The normal rules hadn't been bent. They had been erased. She read the contract again, slower this time, line by line. The justification section, only 3 sentences. Due to rapidly escalating conditions at border detention sites and the urgent need for enhanced containment capacity, the Office of the Governor authorizes emergency allocation to designated vendor to ensure continuity of operations. No details, no description of services, no timeline, no accountability. It was the vaguest language he had seen in years of reviewing government documents. It didn't even attempt to look legitimate, because it didn't have to. The system had made space for this kind of move, a window of total power dressed up in the language of emergency. And Abbott had taken it. She ran her fingers down to the bottom of the PDF where it listed the payment schedule. An initial disbursement of $4 million had already cleared within 2 hours of the file being created. Jasmine cross-referenced it with Treasury movement reports. Confirmed. It had gone through without a single flag. No one had stopped it. No one had even questioned it. Because the people meant to question it had been cut out of the process completely. That was the brilliance of it. The cruelty was obvious, but the silence, that was engineered. Jasmine sat back in her chair, the document open on one screen, her notes on the other, and just stared. This wasn't just a contract. It was a signal. It told her everything about how far the corruption reached, how deep it went, and how confident Abbott and his allies were that no one would look. No watchdogs, no whistleblowers, no internal dissent. They had built a channel wide enough to pour $24 million through it in the middle of the night, and not one person had tried to plug the hole. And in a voice low, shaking, but full of steel, she whispered the words as if confessing them to the air. Now I understand why he wants to arrest as many people as possible. Every detained child is a revenue stream for his friends. She had whispered it into the dim light of her office. Not for the world, but for herself. A confession, a verdict, a wound named out loud. But the world heard it anyway. The clip first surfaced in the early hours of morning, posted by a congressional staffer who had been in the hearing room, stunned by what they'd witnessed. It was uncut, raw, and terrifyingly calm. Jasmine Crockett standing before the congressional panel, holding up government documents with one hand and a photograph of a zip-tied child in the other. Her voice didn't rise. Her face didn't twist in anger. She simply laid out the truth, step by step, line by line, until she reached the moment where silence wasn't enough. Every detained child is a revenue stream for his friends. The internet didn't just react. It erupted. Within an hour, the clip had passed 1 million views. It was reposted by teachers, by nurses, by veterans, by celebrities, by exhausted mothers who watched it at their kitchen tables with coffee going cold in their hands. By the end of day 1, it had crossed 10 million views. Day 2, 35 million. By the third day, it had exceeded 50 million views and counting, blasting across every major platform like a national siren no one could shut off. The hashtags followed fast and furious. #justice at the border. #Abbott profits from pain. #children are not currency. And then came the remixes. Clips cut with drone footage of detention camps. Black and white photos of civil rights protests from 1965 spliced with Jasmine's voice. TikToks from high schoolers quoting her line with fire in their eyes. Veterans stitched the clip with their own testimonies. I fought overseas and came home to this. Lawyers began duetting with annotated breakdowns of the contract she exposed. A Texas nurse posted a video that simply said, "If I'm treating children like patients and is treating them like profit, who's a criminal?" The media split in half, fractured cleanly along ideological fault lines. Fox News was first to pounce. By that evening, they ran a headline that read, "Congresswoman accuses Texas of child forecast scheme." The following hour, pundits rotated across the screen. Reckless, hysterical, fabricated outrage. One host stared straight into the camera and said, "Jasmine Crockett doesn't want justice. She W.